This is Glenn Healy.
Hi, this is Braden Holtby.
This is Daryl Sutter.
Hi, this is Brian Burke.
This is Jordan Tutu.
This is Keith Morrison.
This is Kelly Rudy.
Hi, this is Scott Hartnell.
Hey, everybody. My name is Theo Fleury.
This is Tim McAuliffe of Sportsnet, and you're listening to the Sean Newman Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast, folks. Happy Wednesday. Hope everybody's having a great day. We're doing a little follow-up from episode 201 when I had Julie Ponesse, Professor Julie Ponesse on. Obviously, things have changed in her life, and I thought it just to get her back on, update everybody, discuss some things, and obviously we're going to hear that. But before we get there, let's get to today's episode sponsors. Jim Spinerath and the team over at Three Trees Tap and Kitchen. They got a new beverage on tap, the Honey Cream Ale from Siding 14 Brewery in Ponoka. And it sounds like they're going to be rotating a bunch of their beverages in there alongside Rimstone Creek and 4th Meridian. So a nice selection of local breweries, or at least Alberta breweries, which is pretty cool. If you're wanting to get gift cards, win some gift cards, that is, you follow them on social media, interact with them, and they're giving out gift cards weekly. And finally, if you're looking to take the special someone out, make sure you call and book a reservation, 780-874-7625. Don't be like me and just show up hoping to get a spot. HSI Group, they are the local oil field burners combustion experts that can help make sure you have a compliance system working for you. The team also offers security, surveillance, and automation products for residential, commercial, livestock, and agricultural applications. They use technology to give you peace of mind so you can focus on the things that truly matter. Stop in today, 3902 52nd Street, or give Brody or Kim a call at 306-825-6310. Mac Construction, they've been doing business locally for over 12 years with over 100 homes completed. They are a design, build, custom home operation that has specialized in constructing new homes, custom homes, cottages, and RTMs throughout Lloydminster and communities. In addition to custom home building, they also do extensive renovations to residences and light commercial work. If you're looking for your dream house, head no further. Head to macconstruction.ca. All right. Jen Gilbert and team for over 45 years, since 1976. The dedicated realtors of Coldwell Banker Cityside Realty have served Lloydminster and the surrounding area. Star Power is what they offer their clients. That is 7-day-a-week access to them, because they know big life decisions are not made during office hours. And did you know, when it comes to rental properties, they are the biggest licensed residential property management company in the city of Lloydminster. They deal with over 250 rental units. We're talking houses, apartments, and condos. All right. They know home is truly where awesomeness happens. Coldwell Banker, Cityside Realty, for everything real estate, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Give them a call, 780-875-3343. Agland. Now, harvest is slowly, quickly, I don't know what the farmers say. What do you boys saying out there? You're probably yelling at the radio right now. I say quickly, but maybe you're praying for dry days so you can get it all wrapped up. Agland wants to let you know they still have a great selection of pre-owned combines with excellent financing, so stop in today and see how they can help you. And here's a little bit of Agland history. They started here in Lloydminster back in 1957 as a John Deere equipment dealer with a staff of 6. Now they have over 60-plus years of business and have changed while they're now operating in multiple locations, Vermilion and St. Paul, with their staff of over 130. And they sell and service John Deere products as well as other lines such as Brant, Bobcat, Dangelman, and AA trailers. They're located here in Lloydminster on Highway 16 and Range Road 14 on the west side of town, or just give them a call, 780-875-4471. If you're looking for outdoor signage, the team over at Read 'em Right is what makes the podcast look sharp. If you've seen the billboard, give them a call, 306-825-5111, see what they can do for you. Maybe hassle Mrs. Deanna Wandler. She always seems to have some great ideas, and I'm sure she'll be willing to field your calls. Gartner Management is a Lloydminster-based company specializing in all types of rental properties to help meet your needs. Whether we're looking for a small office or a 6,000-square-foot commercial space, give Wade Gartner a call today, 780-808-5025. And if you're heading into any of these businesses, make sure you let them know you heard about them from the podcast, right? Now, let's get on to that T-bar-1 tale of the tape. She earned her Ph.D. in philosophy and ethics from Western University, a degree in bioethics. She is a former professor at Huron College, an affiliate of Western University in London, Ontario. I'm talking about Professor Julie Ponesse. So buckle up. Here we go. So first off, welcome to the Sean Newman podcast. Today, I'm joined by Julie Ponesse, and I keep saying that and hoping it'll sound more right the more I say it. I hope I got it correct.
You do.
Well, thank you, ma'am, for hopping on with me. What has become very standard now in any show I listen to, any guests I have on with credentials, I think it's important for the audience to hear a little bit about your background, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I have a Ph.D. in philosophy from Western University. I teach philosophy at Huron College, which is an affiliate college of Western University. And I specialize in ethics and ancient philosophy, and within ethics, ethical theory, but specifically bioethics. So I also have a degree from the Joint Center for Bioethics and a diploma from the Kennedy Center of Ethics at Georgetown University. And as Sean and I were chatting about before, in bioethics, what we try to do is ask questions about right or wrong and things like harm and good or bad when it comes to health and medicine. And so these days, when so much of our lives are kind of framed by issues of health and questions about what rights humans have to determine what happens to their body and the choices they make and how we balance that against considerations for the public good, that's what bioethicists sort of think about and work on all the time. So,
Well, I'm curious, first and foremost, at what point did you decide that it was time to get involved, to speak up, to become a voice? And I guess, was there an event that happened or something you saw that just concerned you to kind of, it's not an easy place where all of you accredited people are stepping out and starting to talk about this. It's not an easy spot to be thrust into, so to speak.
it's not for sure. Let me speak to that first, and then I'll kind of backtrack and explain so maybe the history of how I got involved. I think, first of all, it's worth saying that we have two choices these days. We can act so as to feel safe, or we can act with moral courage. I think those are our two options. And acting to feel safe is what I see 80–90% of the population doing. And some people within that group are, I think, following the government and the public health orders, probably because they genuinely believe that they're best. Some people within that group are following them because they don't really have a view about the COVID situation, but they think, well, if it's coming from the government, it must be right. Other people have an intuition there's something going wrong, but they follow it anyway because they don't know what else to do. I mean, it's kind of a multifarious group, I think. But those of us who are choosing not to follow the narrative. So if we work in an employment context and we're facing a vaccine mandate and we're just saying no, that comes with incredibly severe consequences these days. That doesn't mean that the mandates are illegal or ethical, but the consequences are severe. And I don't just mean in terms of, threat of termination, but what we're facing in the public discourse and from our government in terms of how citizens, whether you're vaccinated or not, that's kind of a different question, I think. But if you're challenging what the government is telling us to do right now, you have made yourself very conspicuous and are most likely going to be the victim of hate speech and some kind of ostracization from society. And there's an incredible amount of fear, I think, that naturally comes along with that. A lot of people will say to me, oh my goodness, this is terrifying. I guess I just have to give in. I guess I'm just going to be forced to get the vaccine. I guess I just have to give up my job. And one thing I often like to say is that there's a difference between, fear and courage. Courage doesn't proceed in the absence of fear, but you move ahead even while carrying it with you. So I guess I'd like to say to people that are watching, just because I'm on here talking about this with you, just because I have spoken very publicly against our government and in a number of different settings, just because I'm very happy to be vocal and public about my refusal to give in to the vaccine mandate, and full well knowing that will probably mean that I'm going to lose my job in the next week or two, that doesn't mean I'm not afraid. I wake up in the middle of the night, I can't get back to sleep, I'm terrified about where our country's going. There's fear and terror all around, but I'm pushing ahead anyway because I'm confident that what's happening in our country is wrong, and that it will lead to, and we can talk about this in a little bit, but if we don't do something, we are going to degenerate undoubtedly into some of the worst events that we've seen in history that I thought we would never get back to again, right? So that's a little comment about the fear and standing.
Well, I gotta hop in quick then, because I bring this up from time to time through all the guests, that the universe is an interesting little beast and how it works. And it's funny you mentioned, just because we're sitting here talking about it, the fear doesn't get to us. So I find this conversation quite timely, I guess, because yesterday morning was my moment of like, maybe you just get it. And like, I don't know, right? I actually had to call a mutual friend in Liebenberg and talk to him, and he God bless him, he was gentle with me, but you know, like, it just comes back to, yeah, but they've already like, just take the vaccine for instance, right? They've already announced number 3, and Trudeau's already announced that he's got for another how many years. So he goes, you're not actually signing up for 2, you're signing up for 3 for sure, and probably 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, not to mention like,
and many other things.
That's right. And you know, I really appreciate you explaining that, because I think there's a perception of all of you that you're no different than anyone else, that you don't feel the same pressures, or people have a hard time understanding what pressures you face. I find it interesting, you know, you're saying like 2 weeks away from probably losing your job, and that should shock people, like really shock people. I think one of the things that happened, you know, like that's surreal to me, is I got pulled from YouTube, and I'm like my episode that came out today is a well-known painter from the area, and it's just his life story like that, you know. And normally I'm bringing on hockey people to talk about their stories and everything else, but because I talk about this with people such as yourself, that needs to be silenced, and that should be concerning to everyone. I guess I was about to ask, I'd written it down, you know, you mentioned moral courage and having 1 of 2 options. I was going to say, why aren't more people doing it? But then you listed off all the things you're facing, and you start to understand why that is a very, very difficult choice for people to make.
And I think I appreciate how you framed that, and I think it's important, because I think part of the narrative, and one of the things I'm seeing on social media is people saying, I think vaccine passports are a great idea because it will keep us safe. It will help us be healthy. It will help. I've just been, the right word might be troll. I troll the Health Canada website a lot, because I think it's important when you're doing the kind of work I do to know what's going on and to know the language that's being used and the arguments that are being given. I don't think there are any, to be honest, but you know, we want to kind of see what's going on. And the words safe and help, security, are all over the place, right? But it's important, I think, for people to realize what the government is quite willing to trade off in order supposedly to give people those things, right? So I have been teaching philosophy in some capacity. I've taught in the States, I've taught in Canada, at Western, at Queen's, at U of T, for about over 20 years now. I've won teaching awards for teaching. I love teaching. I incredibly privilege and value the relationship I have with my students. And I say this not for the sake of self-promotion, but to make people realize that I take my job very seriously. I think I'm doing important work, and I know that I've had a positive impact on people's lives. And I'm about to lose that. And all people who could have taken a class with me in the future are about to lose that, because I won't inject something into my body that I have worries about. That's why I'm about to lose my job. We live in a country where that's a possibility. And I, as someone, I was going to say born in the 70s, but as someone who's lived in Canada at any point throughout its history, how in the world is that possible?
You know, I want to get into the philosophy and what we can learn. I know we briefly talk about it before we started. I always bring up the Nuremberg Code because I love history, a person of history. And the first thing in the Nuremberg Code, and I literally made sure I put it in here so that my listeners can hear it. And if you want to speak to it for sure, but it says the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be situated as able to exercise free of power of choice without intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior forms of constraint or coercion. Geez, Louise, like that comes from a time of maybe one of the ugliest parts in human history. And half of the things in there, you're like,
we're doing,
and everybody's okay with. And now I keep using, you mentioned words and terms that are being used. I'm extremely concerned because everybody has their thoughts on Trudeau and everything else, but he says publicly there will be consequences if he's voted back in. Well, I'll bring it to Saskatchewan. I just listened to Premier Moe's address, and he mentioned there will be consequences, and we will make life difficult, right? People aren't going to be allowed to go, essentially live in society, right? Not going to be able to go to concerts, not going to be able to go to football games. Those are where it starts.
That's where it starts with the non-essential services. But I don't think, and as a philosopher, we use the word slippery slope very carefully, but it isn't clear to me that we aren't on a very slippery slope, right? That it'll start with, well, you can't go to restaurants and, and bars, but where do we cross the threshold where all of a sudden now you can't go to grocery stores, you can't buy gasoline, you can't vote? One thing that I think, and given that there are presumably a number of people watching you today, one thing that I think is becoming clear is that the unvaccinated may have a very difficult time voting in this election. And I would encourage everybody who's watching.
I'm glad you're bringing it up because it just got brought to my attention. Yeah.
I would vote as quickly as possible. So after this interview, Sean, I'm going right away to vote because we may not have the option.
Well, and it's not being broadcasted, right? Like it's not being,
well, of course not.
Like if you're unvaccinated, realize you can't vote on the actual voting day. You need to pre-vote. That should, if there's one thing you take from this sit down, that is absolutely it. Vote as soon as you can, because if you do not, they won't allow you in. And that is mind-numbing in itself.
Mind-numbing. And I think the very sad thing about that is that I have heard many citizens endorse that policy because they say, well, if someone is choosing to be unvaccinated, they've already demonstrated bad judgment and we don't want them voting anyway. That's motivated by a very specific political ideology. And I think in Canada, we have worked very hard not to be discriminatory in that way and to allow people to express their views in the political arena, even if they differ from our own, and whether they're about, economics or healthcare in this case, or education, whatever they're about, right? I don't like the opinions of many of the people that are standing next to me when I'm voting, but that's very different from saying that I think they shouldn't be allowed to cast their vote, right? And to come back to the Nuremberg Code, this is a word or a term that's thrown around a lot these days. And I think the Nuremberg Code has gotten a really bad reputation. And I think that's because a lot of people say, well, come on now, you only need the Nuremberg Code when we're facing a Holocaust or something. We're not, therefore don't bring up the Nuremberg Code. Well, we're seeing some really worrisome things in society. I don't know how many people know this, but the health minister, Patty Hadju, has announced $100 million in funding and more, I think $5 million added to that recently, for building what she's calling voluntary self-isolation sites across Ontario. And in 4 particular areas right now, they're called voluntary. You didn't want to hear this, did you?
But I need to hear it, right? Like you need to hear it. Carry on. Sorry, you're getting my reaction, and the audience
Sean,
doesn't.
I can send you the link to this after, and you can post it.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
And they're called voluntary now. We saw the Premier of Queensland, it was about a week ago now, announce exactly the same thing. They're voluntary now, but again, will they remain voluntary? Right. And so the Nuremberg Code, for those who don't know, is a commitment that was made after the trials following the Nazi medical crimes. in the 40s. And basically, in my view, I've heard this said before, but I think it's well framed. The Nuremberg Code was a promise to humanity that we are never going to do this again. We are never going to conduct medical experiments on people without their consent. And without the consent is important. People are free to voluntarily participate in medical experiments. We have in Canada, for example, a tri-council policy statement that explains, how research is to be conducted on human subjects and explains how the consent process should work. So if you, for example, if you have a very untreatable form of cancer and you want to participate in a trial with an experimental drug, you are able to do that voluntarily. There's a very big difference between that and forcing it upon someone. And if someone, in your audience is thinking, well, hold on, we're not looking at experimental drugs. We are. Because all of the COVID vaccines on the market, now this is changing, as I'm speaking, but up to this point have been available under emergency use authorization. And that's because the trials are still undergoing. And so they are considered properly investigational. And another word for that is experimental, right? And that's for good reason, because we don't have long-term data on what a lot of these things are. So that, to bring it back to the Nuremberg Code, you can take a COVID vaccine if you want to, if you feel that you're fully informed. But because they're investigational or experimental, we've already made the commitment to society that we cannot force that upon you without your consent, right? Something else I think that's kind of relevant is a lot of people say to me, oh, I guess I'm forced to take this thing. Well, there's a difference between forced vaccination and mandated vaccination, right? So forced vaccination would be literally holding someone down and physically injecting them. Mandated vaccination is legislation that requires you to take the vaccine on pain of consequences, right? So you might be fined or terminated or have to wear a mask or test or something like that. That doesn't mean the mandate is lawful or ethical, but there is a difference in that sense. And I think it's important for people to realize that just because they're facing a mandate, you still have a choice. The consequences for choosing against accepting it might be really severe, but it's still up to you. You still have the choice to refuse, and you can still fight, right?
Yeah, my brain goes to so many different places while you talk. It's hard to almost quiet it down because, like, there's just so much going on. I rewind the clock. We have a group in town called For Kids' Sake, and it started in the middle of the darkest hours of COVID and the lockdowns and everything, because a group of people were like, this is really strange and we need to start talking, because if we don't talk, well, we see what happens with that, right? Like, everybody right now feels like they're on an island. That's what keeps coming back. Everybody's like, oh, I'm on this island. And meanwhile, you got people sitting right beside you. They're thinking the same stinking thing. But there's like this barrier that nobody can seem to break through. And I find as I listen to more, there's more of those people coming out of the woodworks going, man, I've been thinking the same things. I didn't realize other people were thinking this. I was thinking I was a little bit strange. Or, you talk about the words they use and ostracizing people, and the government's pushing down saying, that's a lot of stress for people to take. I mean, even if you're doing all these conversations, even if you know that like this doesn't feel right and everything I got in front of me says it isn't right, but still all of society saying, don't worry about that. Let's get it and get on with life and it'll all be good. And I find a lot of people are struggling with that immensely.
It's I'm going to say something incredibly fearful and then hopefully something hopeful. So I'm giving a warning about that. I think everything you describe is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's going to get so much worse in the next few months. Sometimes it's worth telling a noble lie, we call it in philosophy, in order to achieve a certain end. There's a terrible thunderstorm the other night. My daughter was scared, and I made up a little fib about what was going on. That's one thing. I don't think we can do that in this case. I think that the people you're describing, who want to do something about this, who want to resist the government action, who want to resist the mandates, it can only help you to know that things are going to get very, very hard in the next few months. And that makes it, here's the hopeful part, that makes it, I think, so important for us to reach out to like-minded groups. So I'm the chair of the Ethics and Law Committee of the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. We can also give you that link, and you can go on our website and you can join and become a member, but you can also just sign up for our newsletter, and that gives you information about, some of the legislation that's coming, some new medical and scientific information, some of the legal actions that are underway. And as chair of this committee, I'm in touch with a lot of lawyers across the country right now who are working on actions to challenge the mandates in terms of employment, in terms of education and children, and then in terms of the vaccine passports, and then accessibility and mobility issues. And I can tell you that, like, over the last couple of weeks, the number of lawyers that are sort of coming out of the woodwork and finding people to fund their cases, and also finding plaintiffs for their cases, and kind of getting hooked up with the right people and the right groups, and people finding out who these lawyers and what these legal resources are, it's just increased exponentially. And I think you're right that, when you feel isolated, when you feel like you're on an island, it's so much easier for, and I sort of hate to put it in these combative terms, but for the enemy to take you out, if you're isolated. But this is really a case where there are strength in numbers, and where knowledge is going to give you confidence. And I speak to so many people who say, I've had an intuition for months and months that something isn't right here. And then I'll try to give them a little bit of scientific or medical information, or point to the law, or point to some ethical documents. And it really helps to frame those intuitions. They say, oh, well, that's why I've been worried about these mandates, because we have a right to informed consent. Because in Ontario, and you may have the similar thing in Alberta, but in Ontario, we have a Healthcare Consent Act, for example, which, in addition to the Nuremberg Code, says that we have the right to make choices about our healthcare. We have the Canadian Medical Association, the Canadian Medical Protective Association. Both have policy documents that state patients have the right to make decisions about their own healthcare, and healthcare providers have an obligation to inform them of risks, however small those risks are, to contextualize those risks. So at the international, national, provincial levels, and then also in terms of governing bodies for healthcare workers, it's all the same story. It's just a story that the government isn't listening to right now. Right? And the story is, you have choices. You have the right to make choices about your healthcare, about your children's education, for example. And we may feel that we have far fewer options these days, and we might, but that doesn't mean we have no choices, right?
Yeah, you certainly have a choice in what you do and how you act, and what way you move forward from here. I tell you what, if there's been one thing I've learned over the past almost 2 years, is how influential fear is from both sides, right? You say you don't want to say anything, but it's good for people to hear that, because fear motivates. Like, I mean, if there's anything that we can all agree on, is in the last year and a half, man, just stack the fear up, and people will pretty much do whatever you need them to do to get the theory of
Right.
the fear going away. The problem with everything that's going on is it doesn't feel like it's going away. Actually, we know it isn't going away, because we can see what the rest of the world is dealing with, and it isn't going away. So we got to just grapple with that and move on. So it's never a bad thing. I used to, 8 months ago, Julie, I remember saying on the show, like, let's not go to the Nazis. Like, that's too far. Like, we're going too far. But I mean, my own government's talking about consequences, and that's maybe on one extreme, the liberals, but on the other side, I'll bring up Scott Moe again, because, where my audience is, that's Saskatchewan, who through the pandemic so far has been one of the ones not to lock everything down completely, can be almost given a bit of a pass on how they handled things. People won't love that they'll be like, no, they should have left everything open. They should be like Florida and Texas and all these places. But overall, in Canada, Scott Moe was one of the beacons of, like, maybe how we can get out of this. Well, now he's talking about consequences. So to me, that's kind of where we're at, is if we don't start realizing what's going on and start to act on it, we are going to be worse off. We are going to be further down this rabbit hole of, like, they went from, in Lloyd here, they went from all schools starting normally. We're like, wow, everybody's excited. Kids are going to get to go no mass. Things are going great. And within a day and a half now, Mask mandates are back in. We're back to last spring, and parents are livid, but they don't know what to do. In your guys' eyes or your eyes, what's your thoughts on what parents should do?
Yeah, so good question. Let me just make a quick comment about the fear that you mentioned
Sure.
earlier. And I think, there is some hesitation to go back to sort of the Nazi example. But when you think about fear comes not just from what the government tries to do to you, but from the division it creates within the population itself, right? Um, and at the risk of being too academic here, the word society comes from a Latin root that means something like ally or comrade or friend. And so we not only are at risk of losing a democratic society, we're at risk of losing our society, right? If we stop seeing other people as comrades, allies, and friends. And I think what the narrative is doing is it's dividing us. It's making us hate each other. I'm sure many of your viewers will have seen the front page of the Toronto Star from last Thursday
Yeah.
that talked about, unvaccinated people, they deserve what they get. We hate them. They should die. They don't deserve health care.
That video went viral, Julie.
Yeah.
Right? Like that video went viral. You're doing
Yeah.
this to yourself, and my wife died because of you. And
Yeah.
essentially, do what you're told and carry on.
Yeah. And we don't care about you and we're going to leave you behind and all of that. And when when you think about some of these poignant historical examples like the Holocaust or racial division and apartheid, both in the American South and in South Africa, um, those situations couldn't have proceeded without the kind of division that we're seeing in Canada right now. And that's a direct result of fear, I think. And fear is really interesting. The psychologists know this, ethicists know this from psychological work, that fear is correlated with certain kind of stress hormones, right? And those stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, when you get a little bit of them for a brief period of time, that can actually help you to make decisions. It enhances decision making. So ER doctors talk about this a lot, right? They say that, well, when someone is rushed in and they're coding and, I get a little adrenaline rush and that helps me act more quickly and think more clearly. But if you experience too much of those hormones over too long a period of time, it actually has really harmful effects on your ability to make decisions, and it just clouds your thinking, and you can't manage information that's coming at you, and you don't weigh it appropriately. And one thing we tend to do is we give an enormous amount of weight to consequences or to risks that are very, very small. And so I think now, it's pretty well documented, I think, that the risk of COVID to most people, I mean, if you're under 80, is very, very, very small, right? And yet it is figuring so large, looming so large in people's minds and making them make so many other decisions that I think more rationally we would make, to the point, what do parents do? These are tough times. If I don't have a child of school age, so it's easy for me to say this, but I would be pulling them out of school right now. I don't think this is, and it's hard to balance that with the feeling that, well, I have a right to education, and why should I be suffering, and why should I be removing myself from that situation when I'm not the one who has done anything wrong? My own feeling is that self-preservation has to factor into our decisions right now. And so in the Western community, I believe the situation is quite volatile. Over the last week, because I speak out in venues like this, I've received several emails of a very hateful nature and one is very clearly a death threat. And students, come to me and they say, well, I'm not getting vaccinated and maybe I've got an exemption or not, but I still want to go to school. I don't care. And I'll say to them, I commend your courage. And if you go ahead, I support you. I would just be aware of what the risks are, what the consequences are. Some of the lawyers who are taking on the university mandate cases are saying there is no live choice for the unvaccinated right now other than to postpone your education, because it's too dangerous, it's too risky, and the institutions won't make it possible to be educated without being vaccinated. We're about to see an announcement that vaccination will be required for all youth down to age 12. And that will most surely be connected to school. And, once Pfizer is approved for kids under age 12, and once some of the other vaccines start being approved for down to 12 and then below 12, which is, I think, inevitable, and probably will happen more quickly than we've thought up to this point, that's going to affect school age kids, both high school and elementary. And so, again, Sean, I hate to, I don't like being the bearer of bad news, but I think this is what we're facing. And I know so many parents who are looking at homeschooling. I know it's easy to say because there are financial considerations, and in families where both parents work. I mean, this is an incredible burden, and these are decisions not to be made lightly, and they're really hard. But it would allow you to keep educating your child without the risks of doing so in a social context right now.
Like I say, I'll go back 8 months. 8 months ago, I would have cautioned, but I think as we
I
see,
agree.
as we see what's going on, we had our summer, we hit the mark, the people that wanted to get vaccinated got vaccinated. And now there's a group of us that are just sitting there going like, I don't want to, I don't, right? Whatever the
Don't
reason
see
is.
the argument.
That's right. And normally in history, that's, in the previous little bit of history, that's been enough. Oh, okay, yeah, carry on. Like my friends aren't sitting around going, "Ooh, you can't come in here." Like that isn't what's happening. Majority of society could give two craps. They have no idea what's going on. It's the laws that are being imposed. And then, I was talking to Stephen Pellick a couple days ago, and he was talking about now the public's pushing on the government to impose those laws, and it's becoming this like vicious cycle.
Absolutely.
And so for me, I go like, I was the cautious guy. My line, I got in arguments. I got 3 older brothers. We've had many a discussion on this. My line was further down the list than some of my other brothers, but the line is there, and I can't just keep moving the line because it's like, well, it's there for a purpose. You have a line. If it gets crossed, that should send off warning shots everywhere. And I feel like when you talk about intuition, people have a line, whether they think about it, whether they write it down, whether they actually like dig into what their line is. And when it gets close to, you can feel that. And right now, what's going on isn't a time for caution anymore. It's a time for full on. Everybody needs to hear this and needs to understand what the implications are long term if we don't avert this course of where we're headed.
That's right. And I think it's the time for voting, right? That's one thing we can do. It's a time for writing to our MPs and our MPPs. It's a time for calling them. One thing that we hear pretty consistently is that calls are more effective than emails to your government representatives. It's a time for signing petitions. I know it can feel futile to do these things, but there are only so many sort of mechanisms at our fingertips as a democratic citizen, and these are some of them, right? I would also encourage people to think about, what can I not live without, and how can I secure those things for myself over the next few months? Right? What can I live without? I need money. I need food. I need a way to educate my children. I need shelter. I need gas. I need, I know this sounds, it's just worth thinking about these things, I think, because those consequences of which Trudeau speaks, I don't think he's disingenuous when he's using that word. And if on September 20th, he secures a majority, and even if he doesn't, and even if one of the other candidates wins, we very well may be seeing those consequences come quickly and furiously, right? And
you mentioned before we started the philosophy. There's what we can learn, and maybe something very important. And now my brain is going there because now I'm curious what we can learn that could be beneficial, or that as a society we should learn.
You're wondering, what does philosophy teach that's making us say all these crazy things? That's what you're.
No, I'm very curious.
One of the there's a couple of core courses that almost all students taking a philosophy degree have to take, and one of them is critical thinking or logic. And different universities have different, maybe one or both or something like that. But critical thinking, that's really the tool that philosophers use. And part of that is being able to look at an enormous amount of information and data coming your way and sift through it, right? And try to figure out what has validity and what doesn't. And what information are you going to pick up on and use to make decisions on the basis of? And can you effectively point to errors in reasoning? So if you see the government saying something like, you get vaccinated or there will be consequences, and you know that as a Canadian citizen, we have protections for informed consent, is there something wrong in that is there an inconsistency there that we should be worried about, right? So I think that the things that philosophy teaches us at its core, the ability to look at information, the ability to identify inconsistencies, logical fallacies, and the ability to also, I think one thing probably so many people are feeling right now is just an incredible noise, right? We're not only going through this COVID situation, but we're doing it in the era of social media and probably on the cusp of a kind of digitization of citizenry and political participation. And there's so much noise. You wake up in the morning and and you're just bombarded with whatever you're on, whether it's your favorite news feed or whether you're on Telegram or you're on Instagram or Facebook or whatever it is. And just, being able to tell yourself, okay, that's information. Let's step back from that and make a conscious decision about it. What information I'm going to accept as true and what information I am going to entertain, consider, reflect upon, and reject. And that's that's something that's up to all of us. We don't have to accept everything that is presented to us. We don't have to accept something merely because someone else says it's true. And I think one thing we're seeing these days is that's not a common belief. I think many people feel that we should, as good citizens, have a great deal of trust in our governments, and that's what virtue is. It's to follow, it's to toe the line, it's to follow rules, right? It's to be a good rule follower, it's to do whatever the government says. It's to do your part. What is do your part? Do your part is not, please do this thing because I'm showing you the evidence that it will be better for you and others if you do it. Do your part is do what the government tells you to do and don't ask questions. Right?
Yeah.
And don't ask questions is, and I cannot tell you, I knew one other philosopher who was questioning these vaccine mandates, and he died 10 days after getting a second dose of one of the vaccines. And I know no other philosopher who's trained in critical thinking who is saying anything other right now than there's no problem here. Just do what the government says. Be a good little citizen. Don't question. And that's what's coming from the one discipline in society that is supposed to be good at questioning and being reflective and not just accepting what someone else says because they say it or because they have a position of power or authority.
It's one of the things I appreciate about all my listeners. I've had some people from all different sides of the coin on, but I've been called out a couple times because of things that people say on the show. I don't know. You go, well, I don't know. I listen to you, and I assume everybody else listening is picking out some things like, oh, that actually does resonate. Like, I like that, or I don't agree with that, and that's what we should be doing. Like everybody should be doing. And I found very interesting since I changed course, did a 180, shifted into overdrive, whatever you want, and started bringing on doctors and yourself, and I got a lawyer on tomorrow, and like all these different things to like challenge the way we think. I've found, honestly, it's been really interesting that people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated are both talking about it.
Yeah.
And it's forcing them to think about this like on a larger scale. Like you say, take a step back and go like, that is concerning. Because I think in order to win this, to beat this, to stop what is going on, you're going to need everyone involved, not just like, I think the more people you can have pushing against this, the better off we are, because,
It was about 3 weeks ago now, maybe, that I first heard of vaccinated people standing up for unvaccinated rights. And I just thought that was so interesting. And I think you're exactly right. That is fundamentally democratic to me. And unvaccinated people standing up for the rights of vaccinated people to be vaccinated, fundamentally democratic to me. Sitting down at a coffee shop with so if you're unvaccinated, with your vaccinated friend, having a conversation, not just stating what you think, but asking that person, that's really interesting. What led you to this conclusion? Or what do you think about this news story? Or where do you think we're going? Or, how do we maintain our friendship through all of this? Asking questions like that, fundamentally democratic and so important to friendship. And I think those two things are really similar, right? My area of specialization is Aristotle's ethics. And Aristotle was a 4th century BC Greek philosopher, for those who don't know. And he wrote a lot about ethics and politics. And he lived in a fairly small town. And he said that the town he lived in was actually perfect for political participation because it was small enough that you could kind of go to the mountaintop and look down and you could see the whole thing. You could see your fellow citizens. And then he goes on to talk about kind of the importance of connection between people and knowing other people and the friendship between people that makes political participation possible. So I think we need to realize that, yeah, whether someone disagrees with us or not about the election or about COVID, whether it's real or not, whether PCR is good or not, whether, what a spike protein is, whether the vaccines are harmful or not. We have to remember that just, if we're mature people, we need to be able to have conversations with other people and we might be afraid of what their answers are. We might be afraid of where we're going. I don't know, but we shouldn't be afraid to ask the questions. And people are terrified now to ask questions. They're terrified to talk with other people. And that's what worries me, right? But I think you're right that when we see people on both sides, I guess I'll call it, thinking deeply about these issues and being able to see beyond their particular point of view, that's very hopeful and very promising, I think.
Yeah, it's. I agree with you. I see uh, both sides are stuck in their kind of trench, and they're
Yeah,
listening. We now have more voices speaking out and being concerned at what's going on, which is really, really good, right? For
right.
people who, right now the big term of the moment is unvaccinated, right? For that group of people to have people out speaking and just not being jumping off the cliff with their arguments, just being like, listen, this doesn't make any sense, has been really healthy for that group. The problem I see, and maybe this is going to change, but all the people on the other side aren't listening to those people and don't really want to, don't see the point in it. And that's not, I paint it black and white. It's not black and white. There certainly are people from both sides listening to the other sides, but
Yeah.
we're getting entrenched in our views where instead of listening and trying to pull out some things and like bringing everybody to the table, so to speak, it's your table and their table, and we're not going to talk, right? They're idiots on the other side, and they're never going to change their view. And I've
Yeah.
found from a lot of my conversations, people on the other side are really like, there's really smart people on both sides. You just got to get them to the table and
Yeah.
get them talking, and good things come out of that.
This is one of the really, this is, I think one of the things that's made it possible for us to proceed so quickly to some of these violations of our rights legally and ethically is this construal of, I'll call them like conscientious objectors. So people who, on the basis of their conscience and what they think, are objecting to the government mandates, right? So whether you're unvaccinated or not, whether um, I think one of the things that's gotten us to this point is that all people who challenge the government narrative and mandates are framed as being stupid and uneducated. And, so we see statistics about things like, well, the only people who really are unvaccinated are people who are of low IQ, are not educated, who are religious, who homeschool, who were anti-vaxxers before this, right? There's all of this stigmatization and connecting with groups that are kind of marginalized anyway. Well, the truth is, as you say, there are an awful lot of very well-educated people who have big concerns about what's going on. In the CCCA, we have, I think we're at about 250, 260 now members, and a bachelor's degree is definitely the least of what we've got, right? I mean, we have professors of neurology and toxicology, and so these are people with PhDs. We have MDs. We have MDs who have postgraduate degrees. So we have MDs who have specializations in immunology. We have not just lawyers, but then lawyers who have a PhD in law. Myself, who has a PhD. These are people, and I caution people to say, don't listen to us just because we have those degrees. That's not the point, right? The point is that, these are people who have been reading in these specialized areas for a long time. I'm in my 40s and I've been doing this for 20 some years. So I've been reading about, the history of medicine and bioethics and how we came to establish principles of bioethics, and a lot of the cases in history that where we went wrong, the Tuskegee experiments and forced sterilization in the States, and what that does, what all that experience and that reading and that study does, is it informs your thinking about what's going on in the present, right? So it's not the fact that I have a degree that makes me someone that should be listened to, but hopefully people can realize that there's so much experience that comes with that, right? And there are people that are, we have a person in our group who's a vaccinologist. His job is to develop vaccines and to understand the viruses that they're meant to prevent. And he's very concerned about these vaccines, right? He's more educated than anyone I have seen in Health Canada impose the vaccines. And so I think we need to realize, and even people, in the public who write to me with concerns about this. Really interesting people. I think this week I had an interior decorator, a real estate agent, a novelist, a rower, just from all sectors of society. But the profile of the people who are worried about what's going on in Canada is not a profile of idiots, and we shouldn't be using that word anyway, right?
Well, it's too simple to
It's
put on a
simple.
word like
It's
that, and it sticks.
And it doesn't mean that, even if by that what we mean is that someone is educated and has a low IQ, well, that has nothing to do with your political rights. It doesn't mean you have less of a right to participate in society.
Actually, as society, we've been fighting for everybody's. I was going to say early on, we've been fighting against so many different things and trying to expose so many things for all my life, right? Don't like bullying, being bullied. We're worried about people's mental health. Now we're not worried about it, right? Everyone has rights. We're trying to give everyone rights that they can humanly possibly have. We're trying to make them feel welcome in society, no matter what the case. Not no more, right? It's just evident out there for everybody to see.
My body, my choice. When was the last time you saw that in the news, right? The pro-choice group used that slogan ad nauseum in order to defend the woman's right to choose, but we're not allowed to use that slogan now in order to defend your right to not be vaccinated, because apparently in this case, it isn't our body anymore with which to choose. And that's a really interesting and troublesome double standard. Right. And that doesn't, I'm not making a comment there about whether pro-choice is the right, position.
If anyone took that out of that comment, that's it's evident, Julie. It's evident that we even have to, that it's filtering through society like this. And that we just kind of on a dime have just scrapped a bunch of things. You mentioned that just because you have a PhD is not the reason to listen to what you have to say. I feel like, even myself, that having the title automatically you associate that you're privy to conversations that others are not. You're not coming to medical advice to the three guys who are out on the rig, getting oil out of the ground. You're just not, right? but that doesn't mean they can't do their own reading, right? Like engineers do a ton of schooling. They can look at data too. I mean, that's all they do. They literally analyze data from things they cannot see underneath the earth to help extrapolate one of the now I got to justify this all the pro oil thing and there blah blah blah. But I mean, they literally have the ability to look at maps and sort soil samples and all these different things, and from that pull out how you're going to get, like, it's brilliant. And so we're taking all of these different groups of people, calling them stupid, and what has opened the door a little bit is by having people that are calling those people stupid. Not saying all doctors call people stupid, but you get the idea
from that group.
From
right.
that group speaking out, and it's caused everyone to kind of stop and go, oh, right? Because for the longest time, what do? I'm a salesman. What do you know about this? What do you do? I'm an adventurer. I'm a whatever. It doesn't matter. People can look at data. They're doing it all the time.
And I think your ability to look at data, as you say, and a lot of that kind of filters into your subconscious, and then you come across a situation like this COVID one, and then like something is kind of twinging and saying something isn't right about this. And just to kind of help to frame that, one of the things that very early on made me worry about this situation is that it looks so different from any other time that I've known where they have tried to, say, pass legislation that has to do with healthcare. So one of the things I've done as a bioethicist is sat on a research ethics board. So all hospitals now have a research ethics board, and a lot of medical trials are conducted within hospital or under the guidance of a hospital, right? So if someone wants to conduct a trial on a number of inpatients or a drug trial within a hospital, it all has to be proposed to the research ethics board, and then it's considered and it's weighed, and then revisions are proposed. And then, Sean, I cannot tell you how agonizing and painstaking that review process is. It goes on for months, sometimes years. My point being, if you want to change something or implement something that has to do with how you are going to treat people as patients, normally it takes a long time and a very heavy burden of evidence, and it looks nothing like what we're seeing right now. And the kind of evidence that exists to question things like the efficacy of the vaccine. So the fact that we're seeing, these massive numbers of breakthrough cases in countries with the highest vaccination rates, like Israel and the UK and Iceland, that kind of information should be figuring into Health Canada's decision about how to impose the mandates or whether to impose the mandates. And the only information I see from Health Canada, and so and gets echoed in the mandate announcements that we see. So the announcements from Western University, for example, to explain the mandate say, this is almost a direct quotation, all available evidence tells us that vaccination is perfectly safe and the only way to reduce transmission of the virus. And that is just not consistent with the epidemiological evidence that's coming out from across the world, showing us that the vaccines are not as good at reducing transmission as we thought. There are people dying from COVID who are fully vaccinated, if what we're considering fully vaccinated now is having 2 doses, but that's about to change, right? And in any other context that I've ever seen, that kind of information would be submitted to the powers that be, right? So whether it's the Research Ethics Board or it's the Minister of Health or the Chief Medical Officer or whoever, and that person would look at it and say, that's really interesting. That undermines the protocol or the plan of action that we previously had. We need to look at this more. Let's put a halt or an injunction on whatever we're doing until we know more, until we can weigh more of this evidence. And we're just not seeing anything like that right now. We haven't even, and we don't have to do this today, Sean. We haven't even talked about the harms of the side effects of the vaccines. And one of the really sad aspects of that is almost every day now, I am getting stories of children dying from having the vaccines and people being unable to tell their stories. And that has to change because that's an important piece of the puzzle, an important bit of information.
Especially as we're hearing that they're pushing for
Children.
5 to 11-year-olds to have vaccinations, right? I told you at the start, I got 3 kids under 5. And one of the things that has, given me some peace at times is like they're young enough where this isn't being a question on whether they can get it. Well, that time is quickly approaching where that is going to be out there, and people are
I
going to be
think so.
rushing to do that.
Infants are in COVID vaccine trials in the States right now, so we know that's where it's going.
I'm curious. You look at the world. Is everybody handling it like Canada? Like, are they all having the same kind of conversations we are right now with like, what are we doing? Like, or are there like other countries that are just like, whoa, this is too much. We're done with this.
My understanding is that not every country is like Canada. Thank goodness. And I'm really envious of some of those other countries. And I can give you a few anecdotes. I mean, we have countries on the extreme end, like Australia,
Yeah.
in my view, is not an enviable place to be right now and is making all of the missteps that Canada is making. And I think Canada is following that as an example. And we will just see here what we're seeing there. And I hope we see the kind of resistance here that we are seeing in places, in some parts of Australia. But there are other, Denmark and Sweden. They have all but resolved this situation, right? And they have not followed the protocols that Canada has put in place from the beginning, and they're faring much better than we are. And the fact that, like, you would think that's good news. You would think that a country like Canada would want to look at those countries who are also pretty densely populated in places, right? And say, what are they doing right? What is going so well? Let's reevaluate our policies. I know of 2 people right now who have citizenship in countries in Eastern Europe, not places which have been enviable in the past, and places from which people have tried to escape. And both of these people who have, I want to preserve their anonymity here, but they have very good positions at prominent Canadian universities. Both of them are liquidating assets and moving back to those countries as we speak.
I talked to a doctor who's also from an Eastern, and he didn't mention liquidating anything. He just said, like, we're heading down the same road. He goes, this is why everybody moved here, so we wouldn't be a part of this. And here it is happening in front of our eyes. Yeah. And he's, that once again, that's going and painting a dark picture. But I think if there's one thing people take away from this is like, listen, we all thought it was going to get better. I was one of them, right? I thought summer would slow down and people would just go back to, and maybe come fall, we would have forgotten or whatever, but everything's ramping up. And, I got 3 young kids and I'm getting more articles. I've been reading a little bit on it, right? That kids are dying now from this. And like, I can see, I'm like, wow, is that the next step we're going to? Is that kids are dying everywhere? Because as a parent, that'll scare the bejesus out of you. And then what, right? Like, so then I don't even know what the step is after that. That's getting everyone vaccinated. Is that what the start of it is? Because if we're hearing about it now and there's no vaccines for young kids, it'll become available, and you just have to have a little forward thinking. And I thought, when I was being very hopeful, I thought things would slow down, and they have done warp speed and have laughed in my face almost. Like if I go back and listen to what I was talking about, like I was so far off the mark, but that's okay. It's okay to adjust and continue to listen and get information. But like where we're going is not good.
That's so good though, Sean. I mean, I think the fact that you're able to, you're willing to change your opinions or your point of view based on new evidence. That's not being wishy-washy. That's being reflective and open, I think, to new stances. And on the topic of, kids dying, I think one thing I would just sort of questions that I would put in people's lap is as we go into the fall, and I think most of the people who are sort of in tune with what's going on, I'll say, anticipate that we're going to have a very hard fall, as I was saying earlier, and we're probably going to see a lot of sickness and a number of deaths. And I would just encourage people to be on the watch for and looking reflectively and trying to understand, are these deaths from COVID? Are they deaths from the COVID vaccines? Are they deaths from various immune enhancement disorders that we quite possibly get from the vaccines? Because I think one thing that has been well proven now is there's a lack of transparency in terms of the directives from the governments and in terms of public messaging. And we can't just rely on that as a source of information, right? So if there's more sickness, I would not say that mass vaccination is necessarily, obviously, the right answer to that, right? If that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I've kept you for an hour. I got a couple final questions for you. They're nice and quick and light. I think light. And then I know you got your daughter there. So it's the Crude Master. Well, today it's going to be the final two. It's usually the final five, folks, but we got short time frames and talking about some pretty serious topics. So the one question I always ask is, if you could sit down and do what I'm doing right now with anybody on the planet, somebody that you'd like to pick their brain on things, who would you take?
That's a good question. Oh boy, that's a really good question. Because it assumes that I'd be able to get honest answers out of people, doesn't it? Or that I'd be a good enough interviewer to be able to do that. Well, I've got to say, we certainly keep hearing Bill Gates' name thrown around a lot these days. I wouldn't mind putting him on the hot seat for a while, I have to say.
I think that'd be a fascinating sit down. And I think it would surprise a lot of people, and not for the way they think it would go. I think there'd be some really interesting topics brought up there. Because that guy, as much as lots of people hate him, he's done a ton of benefit for the world, right? Like he's on a different planet, honestly.
Possibly. I don't have preconceived answers to the questions. I would be just curious what those answers were. I'll leave it like that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I tell you what. Then my fun one for you, being a philosophy, a lady of the philosophies. If you could go back in time and sit with one person, who would you take? And maybe I'd even ask on top of that, what question would you want to ask them?
Oh, Sean, these are hard questions.
Well, they're fun though.
They're fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Who would you go back? You've done a ton of reading and research. You've brought up Socrates and Aristotle and all these like amazing people. I'm just curious. And then I'm also curious what you'd ask.
I think you brought up Socrates, but that's who I'm going to pick. Do you know why? Because he is, so for those who don't know, Socrates is kind of the sort of the founding philosopher of the Western philosophical tradition. He's a 5th and 4th century BC philosopher, and he actually died because he was accused by the Athenians of asking too many questions and corrupting the youth, basically. But basically, he was corrupting the youth because he was asking too many questions in society. And so the Athenians charged him and sentenced him to death, and he ended up drinking hemlock and dying. But no one have I ever read or ever thought about was better at asking questions than he was. And I would love to ask him, Socrates, what questions should we be asking now, and what should we do? Because so Plato wrote a number of dialogues with Socrates in them, and just in having conversation with other people and asking them questions, he almost always rendered their arguments clearly wrong or fallacious, and then that was the end of it. And we really need some help like that right now. So that's who I pick.
That's a pretty good.
And then I would just let Bill Gates and Socrates talk for a while, I think.
Now that would be an interview, wouldn't it? Well, I appreciate you hopping on and doing this with me. I hope everybody listening pulled some things out of it, and appreciate what you're doing. And the fact that you could be within weeks of dismissal and everything else, wow, just keep doing what you're doing. Really appreciate people like yourself. You mentioned early on death threats and people throwing slander your way. When I sit here, and I think my audience will agree with me, I don't get that feeling from you. And believe me, we've had an awful lot of guests on here where I'm like, well, I could probably see that you've rattled a couple cages, but yourself, I don't grab that at all. So I do wish you the best of luck, and I hope that we are going to see better times in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you for Sean for what you're doing, because, I can't come on and chat about these things if it's not for people in the media like you. So thank you so much.
Hey folks, thanks for joining us today. If you just stumbled on the show, please click subscribe. Then scroll to the bottom and rate and leave a review. I promise it helps. Remember, every Monday and Wednesday, we will have a new guest sitting down to share their story. The Sean Newman Podcast is available for free on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcast fix. Until next time.